It's History with Stevens.
Steven.
History with Stevens.
Steven.
Welcome back. This is episode 5 of History with Stevens. This episode is about chapter 5 in your book titled Towards Independence. The guiding question for this chapter is, when is it necessary for citizens to rebel against their government? Make sure you can answer this question with specific examples from your textbook by the end of the chapter. Let's begin. Between 1650 and 1750, the American colonies saw massive growth. The population grew from 50,000 to more than 1 million people. During this period, the British government allowed the Americans to govern themselves, and the colonies did so. Most colonies created their own government that created laws and collected taxes. This gave Americans more freedom to run their affairs than most people in Europe had at the time. As the colonies grew, colonists wanted to expand past the Appalachian Mountains and into the Ohio Valley. This is the region between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. The French and the British both made claims to this land, and the French actually built a fort on where Pittsburgh is today, and they called that fort Fort Duquesne. The English, not liking the French claims to the area, sent in a militia to drive the French out of the Ohio Valley. The governor of Virginia sent a 22-year-old George Washington to lead the militia. Washington was hoping to prove himself as a soldier and become an officer in the British Army. Most British officers didn't believe that the colonists would make good soldiers, so Washington wanted to prove them wrong. Washington's attack on Fort Duquesne was a great success. Washington defeated the British forces easily, and the British took control over the fort. Washington's attack on Fort Duquesne started the French and Indian War. This was a war between France and England for the disputed Ohio Valley and Canada. The French and Indian War waged on for 7 years, but the turning point happened in 1759 when the British troops captured Canada. 4 years later, the British signed a peace treaty with the French. The French gave Canada to Great Britain. Colonists were thrilled about this victory because they knew this was a huge opportunity for them to expand the British Empire west. The colonists had never felt so proud to be British as they had after the end of the French and Indian War. However, those feelings started to change when King George III was crowned in 1760. King George took multiple actions that enraged the colonists, including the Proclamation of 1763, the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, the Townshend Acts, and how he handled the Boston Massacre, the Tea Act, and intolerable acts. So let's dive into some of those details. The first law that upset the colonists was the Proclamation of 1763. The British government wanted to keep the peace between the Native Americans and the colonists in order to prevent another war. King George decided to create an imaginary line over the Appalachian Mountains, and the colonists would have to stay east of that line. The Native Americans would have to stay to the west of that line. He hoped that this would avoid fighting, but instead it just angered the colonists. Colonists felt like they had just fought the French and Indian War to expand their empire so they could move west, and now the king was preventing them from doing so. The British government also had to figure out how to pay off its large debt from the war. The British were already paying high taxes, so Prime Minister George Grenville thought that the colonists should start paying taxes as well. They created a new law that was called the Stamp Act, and it required colonists to buy a stamp for every single piece of paper they used. This included newspapers, licenses, wills, heck, even playing cards required a stamp. The colonists were enraged by the Stamp Act, but it wasn't the idea of paying taxes that upset the colonists. It was the idea that they had no representation in the Parliament, the lawmaking body that passed this act. That's where the term no taxation without representation comes from. The colonists were more upset about their lack of representation in the British Parliament than they were about paying taxes themselves. Many colonists protested the law. Some protested by writing Parliament with their complaints. Some refused to even pay the Stamp Act. However, others took more violent actions. Some protesters in Connecticut actually started to bury a tax collector alive until he agreed to no longer collect taxes for the Stamp Act. And they say nothing interesting happens in Connecticut. months of protest, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. However, Parliament passed a new law called the Quartering Act. This law required colonists to house and feed British soldiers. Many colonists didn't feel as if British troops did anything to help them and didn't want to house them. In 1767, there was a British leader named Charles Townshend. Townshend was known as Champagne Charlie because he would often drink champagne and then give speeches in front of Parliament. Side note, he's really lucky he didn't live in the YouTube era. Otherwise, I think he would have had a much shorter political career. Anyway, Townshend was popular politically for one reason. He wanted to make the colonists pay taxes, and he would persuade Parliament to do just that. These taxes became known as the Townshend Acts. They put taxes on certain goods that the colonists bought from Great Britain. This would include glass, paint, paper, and tea. The colonists were once again angered by these taxes. Samuel Adams was one of the leaders of the opposition to the Townshend Acts. Another side note actually, your book can be really rough on people. Some would even say it can be a savage. Samuel Adams was the governor of Massachusetts, the president of the Massachusetts Senate, and even received votes to become vice president of the United States. But this is how your book introduces him. They say, and I quote, "Adams was not an attractive man, and he was a failure at business." Man, I wonder what they're going to say about me. Colonists led by Samuel Adams started to boycott British goods. Colonial women started to make their own garments and made sure anything that they bought was American. Meanwhile, Townshend was replaced by a man named Lord North. While North wasn't known for his drinking in Parliament, he was known for occasionally falling asleep while others were giving their speeches. But Lord North knew that the Townshend Acts weren't working because colonists were boycotting British goods. The British would repeal the Townshend Acts, except for the tax on tea. King George thought that the Americans should have to pay some taxes, so he made them keep the tea tax. On the same day that the Townshend Acts were repealed, a violent skirmish would break out in Boston. The skirmish is now referred to as the Boston Massacre. Britain had previously sent troops to Boston in order to enforce the Townshend Acts. On March 5th, 1770, Boston patriots started to throw rocks and ice balls at British troops. As the mob pushed towards the British troops, somebody pushed a British troop to the ground and another troop fired upon the crowd. When the dust cleared, 5 Bostonians were killed and 10 others were injured. Following this event, many patriots described the event as a massacre. They made it seem as if British soldiers had shot at peaceful citizens who were minding their own business. Even though the actual events were a little bit more complicated than that, this made many patriots angry, and they wanted all the British troops removed from the colonies. In 1773, the Tea Act was passed by Parliament. A common misconception was this law raised taxes on the colonists. However, it actually made tea cheaper for the colonists by providing subsidies to the British East India Company. However, colonists started to become upset because they weren't allowed to buy tea from anybody else, thus giving the British a monopoly on tea. They became nervous that they may try to do this for other goods. When the British East Company's ships landed in the Boston harbor, they were met with protesters who prevented them from unloading any of the tea. Many turned around, but the British governor demanded that 3 ships stay until the protests died down. On December 16, 1763, 50 men dressed as Native Americans boarded the ships and dumped nearly 90,000 pounds of tea into the Boston harbor. This event would become known as the Boston Tea Party. As you can imagine, when King George heard about the Boston Tea Party, he was furious. Britain would pass laws so harsh in response to this that the colonists referred to them as the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts were designed to punish Massachusetts for what had happened during the Boston Tea Party. The first law of the Intolerable Acts closed down the British harbor until the colonists paid for the tea that was done. This meant that Boston couldn't receive any goods by sea or send goods to Europe to be sold. The second law essentially shut down the Massachusetts government. Citizens weren't even allowed to hold town halls without British approval. And the final law said that if any British soldier accused of murder would have a trial in Britain, not the colonies. In 1774, 50 leaders of 12 colonies met in Philadelphia to discuss what the colonies should do in response to the Intolerable Acts. This became known as the First Continental Congress. Some of you may be asking, why only 12? You can blame Georgia. Georgia was the only colony who didn't send any representatives as a sign of loyalty to Great Britain. Remember that there are loyalists at this time who want to support the monarchy in Britain. During a speech at the First Continental Congress, a Virginian named Patrick Henry famously said, "I'm not a Virginian, but an American." This statement represented a change that happened at that First Continental Congress. The colonists for the first time started to view themselves as American and not British. This is going to create a sense of nationalism throughout the different colonies that's going to unite them. The delegates sent a list of complaints to King George and urged him to respect their rights. They also called for a boycott on British goods until the Intolerable Acts were repealed. When King George received the letter from the First Continental Congress, he refused to even respond. Instead, he said that the New England governments were in open rebellion against Great Britain and sent the British military over to the New England colonies to stop it by any means necessary. A British spy, in April 1775, a British spy told General Gage that the colonists were hiding gunpowder in Concord. So Gage got his best 700 troops and had them march 20 miles to Concord to seize the weapons. However, Americans had their own spies and they knew this was coming. An American militia in a nearby town in Lexington was waiting for the British. But the British were able to defeat them easily and move on to Concord. Once the British got to Concord, they were unable to find the gunpowder, so the soldiers started to set tools, tents, gun carriages on fire. Upon seeing this, the American militia marched to Concord to confront the British. The Americans fought valiantly and forced the British to retreat back to Boston. The retreat back to Boston went horribly. More than 4,000 militiamen were waiting for them and fired at them during their 20-mile march back to Boston. At the end of the day, 74 British soldiers died in comparison to only 49 Americans. These battles became known as the start of the American Revolution. But the biggest takeaway from this chapter is how the British were wrong about the colonists. They didn't believe ordinary people like farmers, workers, merchants would fight for their rights. But the Americans proved that not only were they willing to fight for their rights, they were willing to die for their rights. Alright, on a less serious note, let's end this with a couple famous Laffy Taffy jokes. Laffy Taffy, we still need a sponsor really, really bad. You should see my camera. I do this in my classroom. I really need a sponsor. I'm open to you. RC Cola still isn't responding to us. Laffy Taffy, please contact me. Okay? Alright, anyway, here are the jokes. What's the best way to brush your hair? Hold him firmly by his long ears and brush gently. They're talking about a bunny, not your hair on your head. Alright, second joke. What does the bunny, another joke about a bunny, sorry. What does the bunny say on January 1st? Happy New Year! Oh man, that's a good one too. That's going to conclude this episode of History with Stevens. Make sure you like, subscribe, share, leave a comment in the comments. Peace!